or you don't feel right, or if you have a nasty rash keeping you up at night, don't worry about a thing.
Don't worry.
'Cause Atticus Health will make you feel alright.
I'm Ilana Razbash, and this is Radio Architecture.
Good evening from beautiful Bunurong country. We are broadcasting to you live from the unceded lands of the Eastern Kulin Nation. As always, if you'd like to join the conversation this evening, please text us on 0493 213 831. We'd love to have you with us. My guest and conversation partner this evening is SJB Director Adam Haddow. He's a champion of good design and a strong advocate for the value of that architecture brings to communities throughout Australia and the world. He's a firm believer that Australia's future will be better where architecture and design thinking are prioritised, and that good design can deliver both economic benefit and improved health and well-being outcomes. With over 30 years of experience across diverse scales and typologies, Adam's contributions to architecture are recognised both nationally and internationally. His work has earned prestigious accolades, including the Robin Boyd Award for Residential Architecture, the Walter Burley Griffin Award for Urban Design, and the Harry Seidler Award for Commercial Architecture. Through his involvement in numerous strategic initiatives, Adam significantly shapes urban policy and planning, consistently bringing a thoughtful and design-led perspective. Recognised as a thought leader in mixed-use design, Adam's work reflects the belief that architecture should provide an armature for community life, that the activities, buildings, facilities are just as important as the physicality of the building themselves. He remains curious and driven by a passion for creating cities and spaces that serve the community and shape a profession that supports its contributions. Adam currently sits as the National President for the Australian Institute of Architects. Welcome to the program, Adam.
Hello, Ilana. How are you?
So good to have you on. And
nice to have you. Nice to see you.
Listeners, and I'm seeing you through a screen really because you're dialing in tonight. Listeners will see that I'm alone in the studio, so hello to everyone joining us on the YouTube live stream as well as live through the Radio Karam link. Where are you dialing in from tonight, Adam?
I'm dialing in from Gaddyland, so I sit in Surrey Hills in Sydney. The fantastic Gaddylands that exist, beautiful connection to sky and landscape and waterways here. So we're really fortunate to be here. But I grew up not far from you on the Jabberong land in regional Victoria, so that's also holds my heart.
Victorian boy, we'll claim it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's still in my heart.
There's a question I like to ask all my guests to get the conversation started, and that's, what's your earliest memory of a building or place?
I think probably my earliest memory, I have this memory of cutting a piece of pine flooring in a house that my dad was building for us. We moved. He built the house in Ararat, and we were moving in, and the theory or the story goes from my mother that they moved into the house before the floor was down, so we just had a dirt floor in one of the rooms, and she must have cracked it with Dad and forced him to put the floor down. And I remember, I was like 1 or 2 or something, and I there's a photo of it. Maybe the photo has kind of triggered my memory, but kind of pretending to saw a piece of wood. That's my earliest memory, I think.
There's like a classic Australian construction story as well.
Absolutely.
Moving in, the house isn't quite finished.
Yeah,
someone's
100%.
Getting frustrated and you have to get it done.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Is that where your passion or interest for housing might have come from?
Probably. I mean, I grew up out of town, so we grew up in the countryside, and we were quite a far away from everybody. So I think probably I wasn't that interested in housing at that point in time. I was kind of interested in the bush, and we used to go horse riding, and I played a lot of music, and so probably my passion wasn't so much in architecture or housing, but it was definitely in design. I was kind of quite engaged in design.
Did you
much
know
more
any
than
architects?
No, none. My dad was a plumber originally, so he was quite handy. He built our house, so he was quite handy. So there was always building going on around the house. We didn't know any architects. The first time I got involved doing architecture, I had wanted to be an architect from when I can remember. Like, I never wanted to do anything else. I didn't really know what the word was. I think Dad had to tell me what the word was to be what an architect was. But when we got to do work experience in year 9, my uncle, who lived in Shepparton, knew an architect because there was an architect in Shepparton, because there's no architects in Ararat at that point in time. I don't think there are even still today. And so I went and lived with them for a week and did work experience. That's the first time I got involved in architecture. Yeah.
Amazing. It was just so intrinsic for you. It was such a...
Yeah. I'm lucky. I mean, I think some people try to find what it is they're interested in or have to look, and I never had to look. I just knew what I wanted to do. It was very intuitive for me in a way.
Where did you study?
So I studied architecture at Melbourne University. So I grew up in Ararat, went to Ararat High School, and was kind of had a fairly normal, I suppose you'd say, rural country Australian lifestyle. I was ready to move though. I remember thinking they call the one end of the main street, Barclay Street in Ararat, the Paris end, because it has a coffee shop. That's the only thing it has to make it Paris, is a coffee shop. But I remember thinking I wanted to live. We lived out of town, a little bit out of town, so you kind of didn't really walk into town. But I remember thinking I wanted to live across. There was one apartment. It was above a hairdresser, and I wanted to live there. That was kind of my ambition, like to live in amongst the activity. So then when we're kind of studying and getting to the point where I wanted to move to study, because you had to kind of move to study. I applied for Melbourne, I applied for Geelong. I thought I would get into Geelong because I didn't think I'd get the marks to get into Melbourne. But I got into Melbourne, did Melbourne University. I went to stay at Newman College, luckily. I only chose Newman College because when I went to open day, the person I liked most was the person who showed me around Newman College. He was kind of like, just a really great person.
A masterpiece.
I applied and I got in, and I lived in a Walter Billy Griffin building for 2 years. That was kind of like amazing, actually, in retrospect.
Absolute masterpiece of Australian architecture. Marion Mahoney and Walter Billy Griffin.
Yeah, amazing. And then my first year tutor who looked after the year was Jeff Turnbull, who was kind of like one of the world's authorities on Griffin. And then my first ever project in Sydney that I won in a competition was a project which had a Walter Billy Griffin incinerator on it. So there's this kind of, circular engagement that I've had with Griffin, and it's been amazing to kind of live in one of his residential properties, and then to have renovated and restored one of his buildings. And now I've actually done 2 of them now, 2 of his incinerators. So that was amazing.
That's like a lifetime dream project for so many architects as well.
Yeah. It was. They were tough projects actually because they were designed to burn, right? So they weren't really designed to be well looked after. They were really hardcore industrial buildings. So the one we did in Willoughby had a footprint of like 40 square meters, but we spent like $2.5 million just holding it up, just trying to get some structure back into it and hold up. The kind of work we did, you cannot even see, right? It was just trying to make sure it doesn't fall apart. And then the one we did in Glebe, there was only bits of it left, and so we had to trawl through people's photographs. They send us photographs in to show us, they'd taken a happy snap along the harbour, and it happened to have the incinerator in the background because there was never a drawing for it. There was no. He had kind of made this building without a drawing. He'd used other projects as a reference point. And so we had to use photographs from people's albums to try and piece together the bits and work out what it was, because it had been owned by one of the inner city councils as a kind of depot, and over the years they'd demolished bits and pieces of it. The chimney had gone and the castellations had gone. It was just a brick box with a couple of really awful windows, and so we had to then try and put it back together and take out the bits that were bad and put back bits that were good. And it's an amazing project, actually. It was a long time ago now.
What's the function of that building now? Is it a cultural space or?
Yeah, it's a little community building. So it's got a really small footprint. It's only about 25 square metres. So we were doing a bigger project around it, a housing project, some terrace houses, some apartments and a new public park and foreshore walk. And it sat right in the middle. And it was originally the incinerator and then sorting sheds. And interesting, it's kind of the first attempt to do sustainable rubbish disposal. So they would collect the rubbish and rather than just throw it into the harbour, which is what was happening up at that point in time, they burnt it. And so then what they would do is the horse and cart would bring the rubbish into the sorting sheds and they would sort it and they'd work out what could be burnt with what. And then they'd come and burn it in an incinerator. And he had patented this process of how you would burn it and how the waste would move through the incinerator and be picked up by this little train cart at the bottom, and then they'd take it down and dump it into the harbour. So
they tried. At least they tried.
They tried. So when we got there was one of the sorting sheds had been completely demolished and was gone, and on the other sorting shed there was, out of like say 24 columns, there was 4 columns left. And one wall. So we rebuilt that one and we reinterpreted the other one and then restored the bit of the incinerator was left, and we did an interpretation of the original chimney to give it the height back, so that it used to be the tallest building on the peninsula, and so we wanted to give the height back so people could see that.
Wow. And having this engagement with the Griffins over time, getting to live in one of their buildings and working on it, what architectural lessons have you learnt that you can only get from being up close? Because listeners already know that what you see in pictures isn't the same as in reality. Yeah. And when you visit a building, it's completely different. And then when you study the drawings and you do an analysis of precedents, that's again different learnings, different experience. But then when you actually work on it, in a kind of next custodian architect capacity as the next project or design architect as part of that legacy. Yeah.
I think that the thing for me was there was an incredible kind of volumetric play. So they played with scale and there was compression and expansion all through the project. So that was about I suppose, creating a journey and a reveal, which I really appreciated. But above all, I think the one thing that I really appreciated the Griffins is their connection to landscape and how the buildings were, even though they kind of sit in a lineage that you can read through Frank Lloyd Wright's work and other contemporaries of that period, but they are uniquely Australian. There's something very local about them, which I really appreciate. So there's this kind of idea of having a global perspective, but a really local impact. And then when you go and look at some of the buildings that Griffin has done in Sydney around Castlecraig, which, as that was a development, Griffin was a developer in the end. Like they bought all this land and broke it up and started to build houses on it. And so he had this ambition of really living what he was preaching. And then you see some of the houses that built up around Castlecraig, and they're remarkable. They're beautiful. They're quite modest, I would say. A lot of the buildings are quite modest. Like Newman College is the largest built building that he produced. Obviously, Canberra, the largest master plan, or the largest city, obviously. But Newman College is the largest built building. And, to think that part, if you've ever been to Newman College, it's only half of, or even 1/3 of what was designed. So it was meant to be mirrored around a chapel, and the chapel that's there is not the chapel that he designed. There was a really, remarkable chapel building. But yeah, I mean, I think it's that connection to landscape, that idea of a humility and a kind of quietness in a way of the space. But there was this idea about the Australian bush and what that meant to them.
And so important for connection to place that just rolls into good sustainability in the early beginnings of sustainability, right?
Yeah. 100%.
Often Newman College is open for Melbourne Open Week, for Melbourne Open House. So listeners should keep an eye out for that program coming up in July. Will be announced. An amazing way to see architecture in buildings that aren't usually open.
Yeah, amazing.
Especially the weird and wacky. And I think we have some incinerators and morgues up on the program that I saw some bit of a promo go out on all the weird and wacky spaces that folks can visit.
That are open. Yeah, amazing. There is an incinerator. There's a Griffin incinerator in Essendon, actually.
Wow. So much to tour, especially in regional Victoria and good places to see around. The journey to Sydney, I do want to ask, was it hard leaving home in your home state?
It wasn't an active decision. So I had moved to Melbourne to study, and I think that's a big challenge for country kids. Like there was no choice. You either moved or you didn't study. So, I moved to Melbourne to study. And at the time I was quite excited about that, but I had friends who weren't. And, I think that's particularly challenging. But, I loved being in Melbourne. And I remember I still knew no architects. And I applied for because you used to have to do 3 years of study and then 1 year of work experience and then 2 years of study. So for my 1 year of work experience, I applied to about 20 firms. I just wrote letters and SJB responded. And so I went in for an interview, and Helen Sinman, so one of the S's in the SJB, interviewed me. And I honestly think, Ilana, I got the job because the work experience student before me, his name was Adam, and she thought it would be easy for the partners to remember who I was.
and Adam number 2 was in.
Correct, Adam number 2. So I started, and then when I worked at SJB through the rest of my education. And then I finished uni and I went back to SJB, and during that period of time, there was 2 projects in Sydney that were happening. So 2 hotel projects, and we were doing a competition for a new project in Sydney, and there was no one to do it. So they said, "Here, you do the competition." I think maybe not expecting anything out of it, just as an opportunity, let's do it. Anyway, we won. So I moved to Sydney for 3 weeks to hand the project over to a project architect who was up here. And I was still dealing with my sexuality at that stage. So I was kind of like, I came up to Sydney, and it was an incredibly, one of those days in Melbourne where the rain was sideways and it was freezing. And one of those days in Sydney where it was just the most glorious day you've ever been in your life. It was sunny and crisp and gorgeous. And I went on to the top of the building that was an adaptive reuse project. I went to the top and I looked out and you could see the harbour, and I was like, I am never leaving.
It's a good omen.
And this is amazing. So anyway, it gave me a chance to be in a different place and, deal with my own life, but also, invest in thinking around this competition that we won, which I got to work on then for the next 4 or 5 years of my life.
And you've been at SJB ever since. It's such a rare story. You really don't hear that these days.
I've never worked anywhere else, Ilana. People ask me, what's it like to work at SJB? I'm like, well, I wouldn't know because I think it's fabulous, but I've never worked anywhere else. Yes, I started as a student. We won the competition. I started to work on that. Then we won that second competition, which was the incinerator project. And that's kind of when I knew I would stay in Sydney. And about 2 years after that, the partners asked me to become a partner. So I was like, sure, why not? What's there to lose? And that was 25 years ago. So I came for 3 weeks, 25 years ago.
Fresh after graduation, basically. So you were offered partnership within a few years. Yeah, pretty much.
And, it was really incredibly generous, incredibly generous of the SJMBs to, I suppose, give me a level of custodianship over their business, but at the same time, the opportunity to make a new business in Sydney because it was new. So it was the best of both worlds. I got to do something I wanted and also had the support of people who had done it before.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What's the biggest lesson your mentors taught you? And I've interviewed one of your mentors. Listeners will remember my conversation with Charles and Leah Justin.
One of the biggest lessons, I think that the thing they instilled in me was a level of equity. They never, equity in people, that everyone has something to offer, and that you should never judge a book by its cover, and you should always create opportunity for people. That's probably the thing. And I think, I've thought about it a lot actually, because SJB has always been incredibly successful at allowing people space in the business and to be who they want to be and engage in the world in the way they want to engage. And so I think even when I was a student in the Melbourne office, there were refugees working in the Melbourne office. And so there was this incredible sense of, I suppose, they were just open. There was an incredible sense of openness, and I think that's probably my biggest learning is that people are everything. Mm-hmm. If you get people right, the practice works, the projects work. If you get people wrong, or you don't treat people the right way, It doesn't kind of matter how good you are at what you do, it'll never be great.
Completely.
Mm.
In your role as national president, are you feeling you're able to communicate that to other practices across our profession to helping encourage some of these better leadership structures or better ways of being professionals, better ways of relating to each other?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think it's I do believe in the whole thing, you can't be what you can't see. So as a kind of leader at the moment, as being the president, I think it's important to kind of live by those values and be me and not kind of try to be somebody else. But at the same time, I think it's a very long process to ensure that the profession is collectively engaged. So we're better when we're together. So there's a strength in us collectively, and you want to make sure that you don't kind of leave people behind. So the work that Parlour do and supporting that, I think, is super important. There's the kind of the work that has been done by people like Dr. Naomi Stead, who has been driving the health and wellbeing of architects program. Just investing in, like, as an office, we invested in that, but I think as a profession, we all invested in that. So I think that's super important. And I don't think it's one thing. I think it's lots of things, right? You've got to be generous, and you've got to say yes, and you've got to think the best of people. And I think that we're lucky in architecture because we get up every morning, I think, thinking about how we can make the world better. No one gets up. I don't think any architect gets up in the morning and thinks, how can I make the world worse?
Completely. And you've got to almost be a raging optimist to thrive in the profession. And I'll add to that, and I feel that no architect wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to run a bad business, or I'm going to be mean to my staff, or I'm not going to represent the profession well. Yeah. And I have been thinking for a while that perhaps it is the procurement that is failing us, that is indeed setting up these situations and systems where people aren't showing up as their best and practices can't be run as their best, and our profession gets this really difficult reputation. Yeah,
100%. I mean, I think there's a few things that lead to us not being our best. I think procurement is one. I think cultural knowledge is another that really stems from our education system and valuing design collectively, not just architecture, but valuing design. I think there's also, we've shifted from a kind of very white-dominated colonial environment in our teaching and the structures. And I think finally we're moving to a position where we acknowledge the value of other. I say that as a white middle-aged man, like I can't actually believe I'm a white middle-aged man, but like
the middle-aged part happened quick, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I knew I was white. The middle-aged bit came across a bit quickly, but I do think that there's a genuine shift, and I think a genuine mentality shift. And again, I don't think there's many architects who are negative. I think some of their actions come across as negative because they maybe haven't kept up with the kind of education that they need to ensure that they can engage properly and proactively within a kind of cultural environment that we live in. But yeah, I mean, I think it's fabulous. I mean, I love our office. We have I think 30 or 40 different nationalities working in our office. We have all people of all genders, all socioeconomic backgrounds. I've spent the last 20 years working on the kind of physical and legal and economic structure of our practice to change it, because in essence, the way practices generally are organised, when you start off with something and you invest time in it, and that investment of time is worth something in 20 years' time when you sell it, inverted commas. But to me, and we were getting to that place as an office where I was starting to think, okay, I need to invite some more people to come and take directorship positions in the office. But if I used the old model, that the people who were me then wouldn't be able to afford to be involved, because, I didn't come from a family of wealth, and I didn't have a lot of connections. So it was it was all about what I could do for myself. And so, you need to make sure that people from diverse backgrounds and from low socioeconomic backgrounds as well can become partners in a practice, right? So it means you can't value the practice in the traditional way you value a practice. So, and that's taken me a long time of thinking and working out how do you make that happen, and we've actually just changed it so that
so it's like a B Corp, or you've innovated your own structure there?
No, we innovated our own structure. We essentially moved from it's a really stupid term, but what's the term now? It's just dropped out of my head. But essentially a value practice to a non-value practice. So a kind of a wealth practice to a place where you say that actually the shares are going to be worth nothing, and actually the way you engage is through you, not through your money, I suppose.
Right.
Yeah, goodwill to non-goodwill. That's the word. That's what I was looking for. So we've moved from a goodwill practice, which means you sell the goodwill, you build goodwill, and then you sell the goodwill, to a non-goodwill practice where we're not valuing the goodwill. We're just valuing contribution.
It's so interesting. There's so many evolving models that people can consider when they're starting their business, when they're developing it, when they're expanding it, and especially with where we're headed next and how we're shifting. But the really core important thing is ultimately to grow the slice of the pie and grow the business and keep communicating the value of design and good design, right, is the role of all of us architects. Yeah. And I want to pick up on that point you mentioned earlier, that as a society we aren't valuing it enough. Yeah. And what are some of the Institute's strategies at the moment to really keep pushing across the value of good design to a broader public? And really, I've been finding that a lot of the public doesn't understand what an architect does. And I get into these conversations where people are saying to me, surely there's somebody who can bring all this together. Okay, yes, that's the architect. Hello. Correct. That's exactly what we do.
Correct. I mean, I think we were talking about the other day, Julia Gillard during the GFC made a really revealing comment, which really, it actually hurt me actually when she said it. They were during the GFC, they decided that the way that they were going to get money into the economy was to build school halls around Australia. Yeah. And they wanted to do it quickly. And in one of her press statements, media conferences, she said something along the lines of, we're not going to let design get in the way. We're not going to let architects get in the way. We're going to build. Oh,
and that hurts even to hear it again.
I know, it hurts so much. And, there's no such thing as no design. There's only good design or bad design. There's no such thing as no design. You are always designing. It's either being designed badly or it's being designed well. And what we want to try and do is get more of the society and more of our communities in the designing well phase and realizing the value of that designing well. And the value comes down to health and well-being and mental health and the environment, how our kids can walk to school as opposed to not walk to school. So I think that's super important. So one of the things that we've been talking about and we've been pursuing as a kind of policy position at the Institute is the appointment of a federal government architect. So if you think about, we have a chief health officer, we have a chief scientist, and really they have really significant roles in the health of our society in terms of the chief health officer and innovation and technology in the way science is looked at. And if you think of the proportion of our economy that sits in construction and the fact that every Australian engages in built environment, so it touches everybody, we think that there needs to be some more strategic work done at a federal level around the way in which what our settlement patterns are, how we spend money, where we spend money, what's the kind of infrastructure work being done, and to look at de-siloing some of the portfolios. So, is there a reason that there isn't, if we think about building hospitals, just as an example, we used to build hospitals and we used to build nurses' quarters with hospitals. We kind of stopped doing that. So why aren't we building housing next to hospitals as part of hospital projects to house people on lower incomes who are working in the hospitals? Because what you're finding at the moment is you're getting people travelling long distances to provide very essential services, like in the health sector, in the education sector, in the just cleaning and even construction sector, packing shelves. Like there are those kind of jobs where they're not highly paid but highly regarded and needed. We need to make sure we provide housing. So, why does I've always thought it's kind of interesting, like Coles or Woolworths, they build a supermarket and all of the people who stock the shelves in that supermarket generally come from another suburb because they can't afford to live in that suburb. And you think, well, okay, let's just take in Sydney, let's just say there's a supermarket in Bellevue Hill. Why do all the people who stop the supermarket in Bellevue Hill have to live in Blacktown? Like, why do they commuting an hour in each direction to get to and from work? And essentially what we're saying is actually the suburb that the supermarket sits in doesn't have to take responsibility for the for supporting the people that work in the supermarket to provide the services for the people who live in that suburb. And I think actually that's a really negative thing for us to do as a society. We should be thinking about the fact that Coles and Woolworths should be providing housing on their sites for the people who work in there, for the benefit of the people who live in that suburb, right? And that kind of creates diversity. It creates kind of that. And I like to talk about it as a balanced diet. You know, like everyone knows what a balanced diet is in their life, in the way in which they eat. But we need a balanced diet in our built environment, and we need that diversity of people and that diversity of building and that diversity of product. And so the fabulous thing that we have in Australia at the moment is we have, in essence, all of our states and territories have a government architect. And those government architects work at a kind of strategic level, at state government level, to ensure that the deployment of the resources and the engagement of design is happening across the built environment. And in even better circumstances, we have city architects. So there's a city architect of Parramatta, there's a city architect of Blacktown. And what you're getting then is a really amazing network of architects working in government, and sometimes they're official as a government architect, sometimes they're working in the background, like on the metro lines in Sydney for Sydney Metro. But they're communicating with, through the kind of the government institutions, they're communicating with them, the state government architects. And we think having a federal government architect to help use that resource that already exists and that kind of network of knowledge to bring it up to the federal government level. So the federal government level, you know, housing is the biggest challenge of our lives, and we need to solve it, and we need to solve it quickly. And that we all know there's no silver bullet, but we think having a federal government architect could help find solutions that are realisable, not just kind of fanciful.
Absolutely. What is the biggest barrier or that we have to get over, or the immediate next step that needs to be taken to bring that federal government architect into existence? What's actually stopping us right now?
So I think there's a couple of things. One is me being able to clearly communicate the value. And again, I think if you get back to as a society, we're not particularly well versed at talking about the value of design. So we need to think about the value of design and how does it change the lives of everyday Australians, because ultimately politicians are responsible to their constituents, and their constituents need to see change. And there are other parts of the society that shout louder. And, you know, if you talk to different parts of the built environment sector, they'll be saying, oh, the most important thing for housing is building new roads. The most important thing for housing is letting me rezone a farm into, you know, a super lot subdivision, when actually we need to be stronger in our position and we need to communicate it more clearly. So there's a role for me as the current president to clearly communicate the need for it, and that, you know, the cheapest house to build isn't necessarily the cheapest house to live in. So what we don't want to be doing is building cheap housing that people can afford to buy, but housing that people can't afford to live in. And so if they're buying a cheap housing out on the edges of the city, which is completely disconnected, has no public transport, alienates them from their communities, means that they have to travel an hour and a half or an hour to work every day by car, means they have to travel on toll roads, means they have to, you know, put petrol in their car every day. You know, those things add up. So while it might on the surface appear to be cheap, in the reality that the everyday use of that is actually quite expensive. You know, we were talking a little bit about, we were doing some work as our office, we were doing some work with Housing New South Wales around social and affordable housing. And we were working with a community who were really opposed to us creating some apartment buildings, and they were going to be it was for a community housing provider. And so essentially we were taking, let's just say, 20 houses that were pretty much about to fall down and were completely at the end of their life, hadn't had enough maintenance, and we were going to replace those 20 houses with 60 apartments. And so, but there were still 20 people living in the houses, and they were quite probably absolutely relevant. They were quite scared about having to move out of the houses. But one of the things we realised is that they'd never been in an apartment before. So we put them on a bus. We asked them to come on a bus. We got on a bus and we went around and saw some apartment buildings equal to the ones that Housing New South Wales can provide. And, we got back from that bus trip and everyone was like, please start tomorrow. Like, I want to move out of where I'm at. I want to move into one of those apartments, because they could see the value in the design thinking that was in those apartments. Orientation, good amount of sunlight, great cross ventilation, appropriate amount of open space, not a lot of maintenance, a new kitchen. Like, they had the things that they could see value in. And so it's often about trying to communicate that. And that's a very direct communication. It's a very easy thing in that situation. But having that communication on a broader level, like, I think the metro line in Sydney has been really good at engaging Sydney-siders in the value of that infrastructure and the design of that infrastructure. It's so busy now that the government is thinking about buying new trains to put on it to cut the times between trains from 7 minutes to 5 minutes, right? Because it's been so popular. And they were saying that one of the unintended consequences is some of the food and beverage in the CBD of Sydney is not getting as much patronage as it was before the metro. And that's because people realise they can get on the metro and go to Chatswood for lunch, because the food in Chatswood is better. And so this ease of movement and this capacity for people to live an easier life has been facilitated by the metro line, right?
And the payback and economic productivity from that, right? The well-being, the health, the taxes people are going to be paying because they're engaged, happy, healthy, productive members of society.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, then allowing housing to be located, higher density housing to be located close to that, because then what happens is you actually don't need all the parks at the bottom of your building. You can actually walk to the bottom of your building, get on a metro and go to a park, right? So it's not just about what's within your walking catchment, it's within your metro catchment, which becomes really interesting. I think a lot of that is about how do you then think about that in a regional sense? How do we make this sense for regional Australians? How do we make that sense for out of suburban Australians? How do we acknowledge the value of some of that critical thinking and some things? And usually, the challenge I would say with housing and the built environment and design and architecture is that it's more than one policy cycle. So
yes.
Someone who announces it and gets the funding there's been 3 changes of government by the time it actually gets delivered. So the person delivering it isn't the person who did it at the start.
It's not happening till it's locked into a contract.
Yeah, and also it's gone through 10 years of construction, right? Yeah. So it takes a long time. So I think it's also about getting bipartisan support. So one of my jobs is now to try and get bipartisan support for this idea of a federal government architect. And really, we want to make sure that it does what it needs to do, right? We don't want another bureaucracy which doesn't do something. We want a kind of really smart office which helps government help Australians.
I want to pick up on that idea of the power of actually demonstrating that you put people on a bus, you took them, that you showed them, you let them feel and experience good design, right? Because the words weren't working, the pictures weren't working. I think that's kind of like the power of Melbourne Open House, right? People come and experience it and they feel it and they're suddenly enthralled. Does the Institute need to put the cabinet on a bus? Does the Institute need to put the upper and lower house on a bus? Get them all going.
Yeah, possibly. Look, I think that we'll find there's general support at a political level for it. I think the challenge is really making the case so that they can sell it to constituents, so people understand why it's there. I don't think people in politics think that that architecture and design is irrelevant. I think it's just about priorities. Where do the priorities sit? And the immediacy of having to deal with a health crisis is because it's immediate and I need to do something that happens tomorrow. The immediacy of an architectural crisis like housing is that I have to do something today which won't have an impact for another 8 years. And that's the long-term vision is the thing we've got to start recognising. And that's why I think it has to be really bipartisan, because we need both parties to buy into it, acknowledging that they're both going to benefit even if one or the other is making the decision at the start.
That's exactly right. That's that long-term vision that built the Snowy Mountain Scheme 1 and 2. That was that forward future thinking that has to be perhaps sold as the Australian way.
Yeah. I do think we have been particularly bad in the last... We don't do built research. So lots of other places around the world kind of have they kind of engage in innovation around architecture and the built environment through built research, and there's a lot of investment in built research. We just don't do that in this country, and it's a problem, I think, because we need to do trial projects. We need to be kind of open to failure in a way, and not failure in the terms of a building falling down, but failure in the fact of maybe, we're going to try something and see if that works, and if it doesn't work, we're going to manipulate it again for the next project and grow on that. So, I would like to see there's some, and I'm being real here, there's some big businesses in Australia who I think have some responsibility of engaging in the housing challenge, like, Wesfarmers, Coles, Woolworths, Bunnings, people who employ a lot of people who, it's all very well to make profit as the business, but you need to think about the health and well-being more broadly of the community and the people, right? And I think that the kind of role of a federal government architect could actually really help that, because it could help talk about it and create opportunities for that to happen and do some trial projects, right? Invest some money in areas where we can try. And it's not only in kind of strategic planning and built outcomes in that sense, but it's also about trialing some new construction techniques. We are an old construction technique kind of country. We're still brick and stick. We've still got, utes and hammers, and we go out on site and we build houses, right? And we're very, very, very good at it. But looking towards a more prefabricated, modular type of construction, which people can make in a shed, in a kind of, a more controlled environment for their own health and well-being. So we're not having to deal with like people getting skin cancers and things like that. But also, can you imagine every month changing where you work and having to drive to a different place around the city? Like actually going to the same place every day and knowing that there's a fridge there to put your lunch in, and doing, knowing how long it's going to get timed so that you can drop your kid off at childcare. It's not only up to the other partner. I think there's some value in that, kind of recalibrating the way we do some of it.
Huge opportunity for innovation. Huge
Absolutely.
Opportunity for manufacturing and redeveloping that part of our economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're innovative people. Australian are innovative people. Like, give them a challenge, Australians will do it. They'll step up and do it. I just think maybe we're sometimes we're so caught up in the doing that we're not doing enough of the thinking to think about the doing. And that's our challenge, right? We're uber successful as a country in a way, and we need to take a bit of time to make a bit of space, to try a few things that are a bit different, and spend a bit of money and a bit of time on those to then ultimately make everyone's lives better.
That's part of maturing as a nation, also wanting to continue that growth and development in a successful and sustainable and innovative way, not just sort of freeloading like a petulant teenager.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a really great book out at the moment that actually the Federal Treasurer mentioned the other day, so I must be onto a good book if they're talking about it at that level. It's called Abundance. It's about housing and the challenges of housing and innovation in the US. It's by a writer called Ezra Klein. It's very much, if you're at all interested in the built environment and housing, it's an absolutely fantastic read, because it talks about how our ambition, our kind of very kind of well-considered ambition about, equity and equality and opportunity has actually resulted in some of the most unequal and unopportunistic moments in our built environment, and we need to rethink that relationship between our ambitions for equity and how we actually get there.
We will share that book with listeners as well on the Instagram for the follow-up post. So don't worry if you missed the title and the author. We will circle back to that one. And I'm still thinking about the T-shirts that need to be printed. There is no such thing as no design.
Correct. I mean, I was talking about that to somebody, I can't remember who it was the other day, and they said, we just don't want design. We don't want good. We don't have to have good design. I'm like, but there's no such thing as no design. Like, if you're saying you don't want good design, it means you want bad design. Like, you can't have no design.
Well, good design is also, so some of us have like big picture answers to that question, and sometimes it can be a very personal response. And I'm wondering, what does good design mean to you?
Good design to me is kind of rooted in globalism. So global knowledge, having an understanding of what's happening at a global scale and kind of understanding that context, but but responding at a local level, understanding very specifically the place you're in. I'm really interested in ensuring that our cities don't look like every other city in the world. I'm really interested in making sure that Melbourne has that thing about it that everyone goes, that's Melbourne, and Sydney is different and Brisbane is different. And, you know, I've done a bit of travel. I've been lucky enough to do a bit of travel in my life. And I think what's started to happen is you're starting to get these ubiquitous cities, which they're all becoming somewhat similar. And they've all got a building by that person. They've all got a building by that person. They've all got an art gallery by that person. You can go into art galleries and you kind of have the same piece of art, just slightly different from the same artist. And I think it's really unfortunate, right? Because, you know, we used to travel. It was kind of interesting. I think up until relatively recently, we used to travel to see the difference, but we would seek out similarities. So we would go to Rome, but we'd find the McDonald's store, right? It was kind of like what we kind of did as a society. I think what's starting to happen is that there are McDonald's stores on every corner in Rome, and now we're trying to find the local Italian one that no one knows about. And I think that's also happening in our cultural psyche, that, you know, for lots of years, you know, whiteness was the kind of thing that people wanted to kind of, at least in Australia, wanted to almost flatten themselves so that we were as similar as each other, so that we could not stand out. And coming from my perspective as a gay man, it was very much about not displaying my sexuality in public, because I didn't want to be different to everyone else. I wanted to be the same. And I think we're moving to a position where actually difference is the difference, and difference is exciting and interesting and celebrated, right? And celebrated in all of its difference.
We have to get over our tall poppy syndrome if we want to thrive too, I think, as a nation.
Yeah. You know what? I was in the Venice Biennale for the opening of the Australian exhibition, which was curated by the first all First Nations creative directors in the history of our pavilion for architecture. And there was a fantastic woman there who was Italian. She's an academic, but she has worked in Australia and worked on country for decades, working with local Aboriginal communities. And she had a really interesting position about tall poppy. She actually thinks it's something that has come from our First Nations history in Australia, because First Nations communities have a very flat structure. It's very much a communal idea about the way in which you live, and you have a responsibility to everyone else, and everyone has a responsibility to you. And so there's it's very unhierarchical. And in a way, her position was, she thinks that the tall poppy in Australia has come from that, in a way to keep people more kind of engaged with each other. I thought it was a really nice reading of the tall poppy, as opposed to the negativity of the tall poppy that I think we've kind of created, right? We've said the tall poppy is bad because it does have bad components to it. But she was saying actually the part of the tall poppy is actually really important as an Australian cultural thing, because it's come from this idea of equity and sameness, and kind of this idea that we all have the same opportunity. Anyway, that's a side point, but I thought it was a really interesting perspective from an Italian woman in Venice for the Architecture Biennale.
Who works in Australia. And that's the amazing thing about Venice, and anyone who's traveling right now is fortunate enough to be traveling in Europe this summer, this year. Get down to Venice, see the Biennale. It's only once every 2 years that it repeats. Amazing pavilion on at the moment. Really good showing from Australia. I'm sure there's so many other great things to see.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, I think honestly, I think the offer that's being made in the Australian Pavilion is incredibly generous by the First Nations people, and it's talking about this idea that relationships are the most important thing to help us get through this stage of the global challenges we have. That, you know, architecture won't solve that problem, relationships will solve that problem. Yes. And it was such a generous offering, and it was incredibly different to every other pavilion. It was like, it's stark contrasts, and it was really amazing. Amazing other things to see as well. The Spanish pavilion was amazing, the Danish pavilion was amazing, the Qatari pavilion was amazing. There were some amazing elements, but I thought the Australian one stood out because of its difference of perspective and difference of offer.
picking up on that point about relationships and First Nations and connecting with country, it's now part of our national competency standards, finally, for architects, that everyone has to learn, the students and graduates have to learn before they can register and acquire the title of architect. And we're still, in a way, kind of living through the question of how to design with country and what is an Australian architecture. But we're picking up speed, I think, now. And we're trying to really unpack that question. It's almost an eternal question in Australia's profession of architecture. What is Australian architecture? And maybe that question is easy to answer about where do you think we're headed next? What are our next explorations and inquiries? And what's the frontier as a profession?
Yeah, look, I think our frontier profession, I think we're doing exceptionally good in Australia compared to globally about connecting with First Nations people and acknowledging First Nations knowledge and culture. And if I think about, when I've been to other places around the world to architectural conferences and discussions, we're definitely leading that, and it's amazing. I think there's a new frontier hitting us, which is called AI. And it is going to be the largest democratization of architectural knowledge we have ever seen, which you could see as really challenging. I see it as really exciting. I think there's this great opportunity to actually liberate, move from a profession to a practice. And I say that with respect to our profession, because I think our profession is really important and the kind of collective nature of the way in which we work together. But I think it's going to be amazing. Architecture in a way is like lots of the formal professions, medicine, law, has been a relatively closed shop, right? You need to finish high school, you need to go to university, you need to be told by the right people, you need to finish that, you need to do this, you need to get it before you're able to do it. What AI is going to do is liberate that knowledge and enable people to engage with it much more broadly, much quicker, and let us think about the things that we really need to think about, which are kind of some of the philosophical things and some of the ideas about way in which we make our cities and our lives better.
Say more about what do you mean from shifting from a profession to a practice?
Profession to me, there's two parts of the profession. There's the kind of professional part, which is about being well educated, having a level of ethics and understanding and relationship to other people in the profession and to society. And like in the Architects Act in New South Wales, actually it's explicit that our responsibility is not first to our clients, it's first to the public. Yeah. So that's a really important thing. It's not unlike medicine. Your responsibility is to the patient. Our responsibility is to the public. But professions, if you think of the old way of seeing a profession, it's a club, right? And you have to possess certain qualities to sit within that club. I think the practice of architecture, which is actually what we're interested in as architects, and this is a thing I want to take up at the Institute. I would love the Institute. I'm kind of advocating for a change of name of the Institute of Architects, because I actually think it misrepresents what we're interested in. So the Australian Institute of Architects, I think, should change to the Australian Institute of Architecture, because architects is a very narrow idea about who can be involved, just the people who did the study and have been registered, versus the Australian Institute of Architecture, which still lets those people be involved, and they can be involved in a very specific way. But I think we need to broaden the tent, have other people who are interested in design, bring them in, so that people who maybe studied architecture but didn't become a registered architect and now work in government or in set design or in interior design or urban design or town planning or law or whatever it is, can be part of our community more directly and can enjoy and share in the kind of, I think, the joy that we have in the way in which we make the built environment and public space. I really think that it's time for us to shift that mentality from the club mentality to more of a kind of collective, more of a kind of broader church, a broader tent.
How do you feel about our protected title?
Look, I think that protected titles are interesting. I think they are very good at protecting consumers. So, and it's essentially what it does. It says someone who has the title has a level of competency. But I think the important thing is that the Institute of Architects is not the people. We're not the people who do that. That's the architects registration boards of the states, and that's that's a state government institution that ensures it's the same as the way you get registered as a doctor or a lawyer. It's the same as an architecture, but the community that we have, while we can respect that and people can call themselves an architect, the Institute of Architecture can be broader and more engaged, right? And it can get the general public more interested in what the built environment and architecture is. So, within the Institute of Architects, for example, if we changed it to the Institute of Architecture, we could still have a college of architects. We could have a college of interior designers. We could have a college of urban designers. We have a college of committed citizens, and people who just want to be involved and want to learn more and want to understand why there is no such thing as no design, and come to talks and we can be much more generous with that, with the way in which we organise ourselves.
But that's an interesting take then with sub colleges and subgroups. And it's in a way the kind of constellation and universe of ideas that are discussed on this program, because they have very diverse multidisciplinary guests that come on.
Yeah.
And we find our intersections and our overlaps, and we talk about how really everything is architecture. Yeah,
100%. I mean, I think, if you go back, architecture was a term to describe all of that. And then over the centuries and decades, we've limited it. And I would say predominantly because of the consumer protection thing, right? Because people want to know what it is you do and they want to protect it. It's become narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower. And, even to the point where it's the Design and Building Practitioners Act in New South Wales has even narrowed it even further, where they've taken out, they're proposing to remove the Architects Act altogether and put it into the building bill. And we're kind of in the same bill with engineers and interior designers and, which, again, I actually think is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as the bits about, what makes an architect special and why we have a responsibility to the community above our clients is still contained within that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's time for us to open it up again. I think it's almost looking backwards to go forwards. What was an architect once? We need to kind of get back to that point. And people who design cities are equally as important as people who work out waterproofing details on balconies. And we've kind of run towards more of the secondary rather than the first, because the secondary is the thing that has the impact on people, because if someone's balcony leaks, someone's not happy. But I don't know why we're as unhappy as people who design bad cities. Designing bad cities is probably worse for us than designing bad balconies,
It's all bad, but I think I agree with your feelings that we really need that federal government architect to help it get better. And I really hope that needle can be moved in your term, Adam, as national president.
I'm really pushing hard.
And we'll get those T-shirts printed too.
Absolutely.
There's no such thing as no design.
Yeah.
I'm mindful of the time, so I will ask my last question, and that's what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? That's a good question. That's a really good question, one. I think that hope, the thing that gives me hope is humanity. I think there is generally in our country an agreement of being in this together, and that what brings us together is greater than what divides us apart. We're in an interesting time in the world, but I do think we are incredibly lucky to be here. We're incredibly lucky to live on this amazing continent, and we're incredibly lucky that the First Nations people invite us to be a part of that. And, some work I've been doing up in the northwest of Western Australia with a traditional elder up there, he said to me the last time I was up there, this isn't my culture, this is our culture. You are as much part of Aboriginal Australian culture as I am. It's just you have a different role, and I want you to enjoy the kind of that 60,000 years of continuous culture, and I want you are a part of it, so be a part of it. And I thought that is such a generous thing to say from a group of people who have been so poorly treated by our society and history. That gives me hope. That is the thing that you think, if they can do that, why can't I?
Such an incredible message and lesson to
made me cry then. Sorry, I was just crying. That made me cry.
Thank you so much for joining us on the program, Adam. It's been a fabulous conversation.
Thanks for having me, Ilana.
Thanks for joining me for another evening of radio architecture with Ilana Razbash. This live show was broadcast and recorded in the Radio Karim studio on Bunurong Country. You can replay the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and supporting community radio. Take care.
Hi, I'm Angus Montaigne, all the way from Scotland to the main